Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Multi-Cloud Maturity Model Video Discussions. And today, I'm really excited to have Kit Colbert, CTO of Cloud Services here at VMware, and a longtime veteran of VMware, starting from the early days to the current evolution now, right?
Yeah, it's been 18 years actually, which is kind of insane, but a lot's happened, and it's been really fun to see the evolution both of VMware, but also the broader industry as well.
Yeah, and it's perfect for this conversation because you have spent time in engineering and in product, and now it's in your role as CTO. You talk to a lot of customers, and especially about their cloud adoption strategy. You've written lots of blog posts and lots of books and such on this topic. When you're thinking about app modernization, specific with as you relate it to cloud adoption, there's this framework of 5 Rs that you laid out. Can you explain that to our audience?
So I have a lot of conversations with customers about how they're moving from their current application estate to their future kind of nirvana, perfect blue sky estate future. And when we talk to them about that, what becomes clear is that there's a lot of different options. For each application, they may want to take a different direction, a different strategic path. And so one of the ways of thinking through that and helping to figure out, okay, how do I organize all these different apps into the different directions is this 5 Rs concept. So what are all these Rs? Well, essentially, they just talk about the different forward paths. So there's retain, rehost, replatform, refactor, and retire. Those are the 5. And talking through each of them really quickly, retain is about, well, this one I want to keep on-prem. Maybe it's not worth moving. Maybe it has other reasons to stay on-prem, that security or compliance or some sorts of issues like that. Rehost simply means we're going to move the app to a different infrastructure. Could be in the cloud, could be on a more modern on-premises infrastructure, but we're not going to change the application at all. We're not going to rewrite it at all. Replatform is actually talking about changing the underlying infrastructure, the underlying technology, sometimes from VMs to containers, say. So if you want to containerize an application, but not necessarily rewrite the whole thing, but just start taking advantage of containers, maybe Kubernetes, that would be replatform. Refactor is actually going a step further and saying not only are we going to be replatforming it, i.e. changing from a VM technology to a container technology, but actually rewriting the application code as well. Maybe moving it from a traditional monolithic architecture to a microservices or maybe serverless architecture. And then the final one, retire, is about getting rid of that application. And that doesn't mean the functionality is not still there getting used in some way. It's just provided differently. Like for instance, you might say, hey, I've got an internal HR app that runs on-prem. I don't need that anymore. I can go out to the web and use a SaaS application, maybe a Workday or something similar. And so these 5 paths really represent the different options that are available for each application. And as I said, it really depends on the specific customer situation, their strategy, their business priorities as to which direction you want to take for which of those applications.
And what's interesting is that it sounds like there is an infrastructure aspect, a vector for this application strategy. There is an application architecture factor to this, as well as like a location. Like, where is it going to run, and is it a service that you plan to deliver to your customers, or will you be consuming this from somewhere else? So lots of vectors for the application decision. And you say it really depends on the customer and what have you. And I think an important thing to call out here is that, many customers have hundreds, if not thousands of applications. So across their portfolio, they could be going through all of these strategies, right, at any given point in time.
Absolutely. If you take a step back, in some ways you might say, well, why don't you just refactor everything? Which is great, because then you get all these amazing cloud native capabilities, dynamic scale and resiliency to infrastructure failure or host failure or these other sorts of benefits. And certainly, if we see some customers going very aggressively in that direction, the challenge is, to your point, like you have oftentimes thousands or some cases tens of thousands of applications, and it's just not realistic to refactor or essentially completely rewrite all of those. And so that's where it goes back to the business priority. And I think you laid it out well, that sometimes it's just about evolving the infrastructure without touching the application. Because again, that application rewrites very cumbersome, very time consuming, and very risky as well, honestly. Not in a bad way, but just in a very realistic way. You could introduce bugs. Yeah, anything, right? Just a normal type of change. So in that case, you may say, hey, I just want to evolve the underlying infrastructure without touching that application, because that can be done in a much more transparent, much more seamless way. And so based on that, it really goes again back to the importance of the application. If this is an application that is driving top line revenue for the company, if it's interacting with customers, then almost certainly you're going to be wanting to move it to a more modern application architecture in addition to a more modern infrastructure architecture. Pardon me. And then that way you'll get all the benefits we just talked about. You can get faster updates to customers. It can scale much higher to support greater customer use, give them a better experience, so on and so forth. Whereas other applications, which may be doing more back-end processing, maybe more delicate to change, but also don't need fundamentally to be rewritten, well, those can just be maybe moved to the cloud, let's say, changing the underlying infrastructure, but keeping the application the same. And by the way, we also see, when talking to customers, a variety of different use cases come out. Because yes, there's certainly the overall digital transformation of their applications, but a lot of times they're really modernizing their infrastructure as well. And sometimes that means, hey, we want to close down some of our data centers. We want to move some of those workloads that are in those data centers to the cloud to get them out of the data center. Some customers, we want to be out of that business. So that becomes a CIO type mandate. And so then again, you don't want to spend months and months or years and years rewriting all your apps. You want to just be able to move them quickly. And so that's what we talk to a lot of customers about, is giving them that sort of optionality so the technology can provide the right solutions to their business priorities and their business problems.
Yeah, and this is a good segue into my next area that I wanted to focus on was, as you're talking about cloud and migrating to cloud, cloud's been around now, 15 years. And it's the adoption when it first came out and it started gaining traction beyond just being like a shadow IT thing. The idea of moving everything to get out of the business of managing data centers was huge. So people were just like, let's just lift and shift everything. Yeah. But and we're still seeing that there hasn't been a wholesale migration to the cloud of all enterprise applications. And some of that activity turned to doing other things like replatforming and some refactoring. What have you heard from customers as to why that is? Which is a valid strategy.
We also see some customers who have either done acquisitions or they have built some modern applications in the cloud and they want to move their existing apps to be closer to those current or those newer ones. But to your point, there's other directions they may want to go too. And this notion of replatforming, which is starting to take advantage of some of the innovations happening in the container space and the Kubernetes space. And so when we talk to customers there, again, we see something where typically they have some new apps they've written, and these are usually microservice style architecture apps. They are plugged into a CI/CD system. They are, dynamically scalable, all these great things. But again, they have some existing apps that may need to interact with those that may together constitute perhaps a large logical application. And they may want to get the same benefits of the CI/CD process of being able to dynamically repave, so to speak, kind of recreate the application instances on the fly. Like if you see a vulnerability that you notice in your code, you want to be able to get the new version out as quickly as possible. Having that sort of automation is really, really critical. And so there people consider things like replatforming because they can get the benefits of that common CI/CD pipeline, that common tooling, some of the common operational capabilities, along with their modern apps, but without having to rewrite their existing ones. So that's a really concrete use case that we see quite a bit of customers saying, hey, I've got a near-term business priority. I don't have time to rewrite everything. They'd like to do that, but maybe it's going to happen next year or something. But right now, they need to get the underlying technology base in terms of the platform standardized. And so that's one way they can do that pretty quickly without needing to rewrite everything.
It's kind of like a fun analogy to this, but it's kind of like when you're moving a house. Sometimes you just you have a really fast move day, so you just pack everything up and you move it, right? And then you'll figure it out once you get there. Other times, if you do have time to plan out a move, people may do the thing of culling through. what's in your house. Like, does everything need to go to the new place or not? Will I replace this, or will I just kind of shift the configuration of how things are laid out in a room in planning for my move? So it's kind of like that, but from the application to infrastructure match.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting analogy. And because you're right, like sometimes it's like, let's just call in the movers, have them pack everything. I don't want to think about it. I got other stuff to do. Other times it's like, yeah, let's walk through it, figure out what I need, what I don't. And you can even take that analogy further. Like, is the house you're moving to basically an identical copy of your current house? Or does it look very different? Does it have more rooms? Is it like differently architected? And that would, of course, impact the time it takes. If it looks very different, the rooms are different sizes, none of your current furniture fits, well, you're kind of forced to redo everything, right? Buy a whole bunch of new stuff, figure out new things. Whereas if it's pretty close to your current house, you can pretty much make all your current stuff fit without too much effort. And I do think that is really, it's kind of an interesting, the analogy part, because that's where when we look at the problems around, like, say, rehosting or even to some degree replatforming, you can actually bring a high degree of automation to that you or your team, the people, don't actually have to spend that much time. If you look at something like VMware Cloud and AWS, a lot of customers are moving their applications on-prem to that in a rehosting model, but doing it in a fully automated way. Like, they're not actually needing to go in and like tweak every single little thing. Versus a refactoring case where you do need to actually put humans on that, programmers to rewrite it. So it's very similar to the house move analogy in the sense that if it's basically the same house, you can get some movers to go take care of it. You don't need to be involved. They can just, essentially, it's kind of automated there, right? Versus if it's a completely different house, you got to rethink everything. Well, that's going to take your time and energy to get the house arranged just like you want it.
Yeah, and then you touched on this earlier about like what is a business priority that would then kind of say like, do you purely rehost, and then the choices around rehosting, right? Would you replatform or would you refactor and build new? When you look at some of the ones that require more engineering effort, how have you talked to customers and provided guidance to them on how to evaluate what should they put there in that bucket? Or how have you seen customers look at that problem and kind of prioritize?
Yeah, you got to set up a process. And we do see this with a lot of customers. But although early on, what we saw was people just kind of gung-ho coming out, we're going to refactor everything. We're going to replatform everything. And
well, you and I we were both pretty active in the container space very early, right? So everyone's like microservices everywhere for every application. Yeah.
People were drinking the Kool-Aid, right? It's like, oh man, we got to go do this. And, clearly there are a lot of benefits. I think the crushing reality sort of hits at how hard some of these things can be. And so, I think the key there is running that process, having clearly defined criteria for each of them, like why you want to do what, or for which of the R's you want to do for each app, and what are the business priorities behind that. And so what we typically find, you don't see every app getting rewritten or refactored, I should say. It's probably maybe 30% of them, at least for a given time. And even that can be a high number. It kind of depends on many, many factors. But typically these are, as I said before, the revenue generating applications, the truly business critical ones, or the ones that customers have to interact with. Again, there the bar is very high because customers want it on mobile. They want a responsive experience on the web. They want to have that really great modern experience they've come to expect. So you need to have the right underlying architecture, application architecture, and infrastructure in order to support that, right? So I do think it's typically speaking a minority of the apps, but that being said, it's also the most important ones. And when you look at it, for any individual app, it may be that it's still an iterative process, even given that. So what we typically see is what we call, I don't know if this is actually an industry term, but what we call it internally is the extraction pattern. That you take a traditional app, so let's say very concretely a Java-based app, maybe running in WebSphere, WebLogic, and it's architected as a monolith, right? So it's a big hunk of code, all running in a single process. And so what you do is, or what we see customers do, is kind of take out a logical piece of functionality from that monolith, rewrite it as a microservice. And so now that monolith has gotten just a little bit smaller, and there's now a microservice running out here. And so they do that again and again, kind of extracting these additional pieces. Each time, it's a few months' work, nothing crazy. So they can kind of bound the problem, make sure everything's working, and offer that change somewhat incrementally, but in a way that's controlled and also lowers the risk. But why is that interesting for this case? Well, what you can see is that you now have this sort of hybrid architecture for the application where you have A logical application has both microservices components as well as traditional monolith pieces. And there you can imagine, hey, these microservices, maybe you want to run them in the public cloud, or maybe you want to move them to different locations. Well, that monolith may need to move as well. And so that's where rehosting or replatforming could come in really handy, because it's a very low cost to do that compared to rewriting the whole thing. And so that just, is one very concrete example of the sort of optionality that looking at these different options can provide in terms of, again, meeting that business priority with the right technical solutions.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing to emphasize here in that it is incremental. It isn't that a customer has to go full force down one of these R's for an app in its entirety to extract any value. Because development cycles and what have you, it could take a really long time then. But if it is a customer-facing app, they can make incremental changes along the way to deliver incremental improvements in experience while still keeping the app stable, very stable, and then taking advantage of things like cloud scale and other new technology components, right? So best of all worlds, really.
Yeah, well, and I the term I go back to a lot is optionality. This notion of not being forced into any particular business direction because of a technology limitation, but just the opposite of having the options to do what the business needs. And the technology actually not only supports you doing that, but accelerates it. Like if you take a look at the spectrum of changes you can make, and let's say one side of the spectrum is where you are today, the other side is, cloud native, nirvana, everything re-architected, perfect microservice world. Getting from one side to the other, that's years of work. And that's all you're doing is just re-architecting. You're not even adding any new features, things that customers might want in that intervening time. And that, taking a jump from one side to the other is just not realistic for pretty much any business, especially of any size. So what the R's are about is providing stepping stones along that spectrum, along that path that allow you to get and realize business benefits, but without a huge amount of effort. And that the amount of effort you want to put in can be proportional to the amount of benefit that you get back out. And so for certain apps, you want to be a little bit more aggressive, as we talked about, get closer to that nirvana. Others, you may want to just go a little bit down the line. And so that optionality, I think, really is the ticket to successfully navigating digital transformation.
Yeah, I think I had listened recently to a podcast that you did with Dormain Truitz, one of the leaders in the our modern apps team, and talking about that exact point of like examples of apps like this kind of app. Like, why would you spend the effort to, rewrite it entirely? So it's really allowing for like, what is the business value that app brings? Is the change and the investment in that change worth it? But meanwhile, how can you still improve and optimize that, right? So there's incremental value available for, every app in the portfolio.
Yep. Yep, and it's about I think you said it perfectly. It's moving. Again, if you think about the spectrum analogy here, it's about moving the app as far forward as it needs to be. Not the realization that not every app needs to be some perfectly rewritten microservice. Like sure, in a nirvana world where you have as many resources and time as you want, great. But we live in the real world where we have very limited resources and time. So then it's about being very thoughtful about where you invest those resources and time.
And, with all these, as you talk about the 5 R's and your involvement across the VMware technology portfolio, can you recap a little bit on our strategy and our technology aspects to enable all of these different patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been, a little bit coy thus far. I called out VMware Cloud Native US, but generally try to keep it pretty generic. But there is a tremendous amount of stuff that we are doing across the board here, really across all the different R's. When you look at either retain, which we haven't talked about, or rehost, there are vSphere-based software-defined data center infrastructure really becomes key, because that is a consistent infrastructure, consistent operations, consistent management, now really available anywhere you want it, whether that's on-prem in your data center, in a colo, in the public cloud, at the edge. And we also have options to whether you can get that as a service, i.e. someone else runs it for you, or as software, i.e. you run it yourself. And so that sort of optionality is huge. And again, we've seen customers take advantage of things like VMware Cloud and AWS to move workloads to the public cloud. We've seen customers take advantage of things like VMware Cloud Foundation to migrate workloads to a more modern infrastructure, still running on-prem. When you look at the replatform side and what's happening there, this notion of Kubernetes really becomes the clear lingua franca, so to speak, of the infrastructure. It's the new infrastructure abstraction. And so, we at VMware are really wholeheartedly embracing Kubernetes. We built it into vSphere. So now, Kubernetes is a native service, a native capability inside of vSphere. That means it's really easy to start running Kubernetes-based applications on top of vSphere and VMware Cloud Foundation and the other software-defined data center offerings right next to your existing applications. But we also go much further than that. We have, of course, the whole Tanzu suite of capabilities that's really focused on enabling customers to both build, run, and manage modern applications. And really, Kubernetes is at the heart there. But what's interesting about it is that for a lot of those replatforming, it's not really about Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the enabler, but it's about everything you can build on top of it. We talked about that podcast with Domain. We talked a lot about the notion of really embracing DevSecOps, this automated pipeline from code to running in production. Kubernetes, again, becomes that sort of key building block along there, but then we have a whole bunch of technologies that we layer on top of it, making it much easier to take advantage of, and also much easier to build on and run both your traditional apps as well as those modern apps. And then for the refactor piece, there, again, a lot of our Tanzu assets play a big role. Spring Technology, what was formerly called Pivotal Cloud Foundry, is now Tanzu Application Service. And so this notion of being able to, out of the box, support microservices, these sort of turnkey capabilities, making it very, very easy to go from a traditional monolith, like we talked about before, that monolithic Java app, into a modern microservice-based application, and making it good as well and easy as well for your developers. This whole notion of developer experience, I think, is another really big one. Kubernetes is super powerful, as I talked about, but oftentimes it can be almost too much for developers. They get overwhelmed. It's a little bit complicated. And so Tanzu helps to really simplify that for them and provide a fantastic developer experience on top of that underlying Kubernetes infrastructure. We didn't talk much about Retire either, but there you do need to start managing your SaaS accounts and be able to provide your users with secure access to those. And so that's really where our Workspace ONE suite of offerings comes in terms of identity and access management, providing that in a federated way out to those SaaS services and making it just a great experience for your employees end to end there. So that's just a quick sampling of the different things we're doing. It doesn't even touch on some of the other areas that we're driving, such as security, which you can deeply bake both in the infrastructure as well as to the replatforming in terms of DevSecOps. You look at cloud management and cost management that goes in there as well. So there's a whole bunch of other things that we do that really, I think, tie it all together and enable you to drive that sort of end-to-end orchestration management across all these different changes that you're driving.
So if I were to summarize this and get it back to your earliest point about optionality, not only should organizations look at their app modernization and cloud adoption paths with optionality in mind, doing what's right for the business, doing what's right for the customer outcome that they're looking for. Even VMware, the portfolio we're building supports that optionality. So whether they're looking to build apps, run them anywhere, manage across a diverse portfolio, and then secure those wherever they are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's funny, right? Because I talked to a lot of customers and they know us for our virtualization, right? Like 15 years ago. But the reality is that today we've built out this really powerful set of capabilities and they are designed explicitly for all the different sorts of transformations that we're talking about. And to your point, they're designed to provide that sort of optionality. I think it's really, a strength, like one of the unique differentiators for us is our focus on multi-cloud, right? This notion that we don't run our own cloud. We don't have a public cloud, right? We partner with all the public cloud vendors to provide that level of consistency, both from an infrastructure standpoint and from an operations and management standpoint. So I think that really is something that differentiates us and something that customers may not realize what we've been up to this last many years.
Well, after they watch this episode, they'll know and they'll go to check it out. Thanks, Kit, for joining me, and we will see you all next time.